Good morning to you. It's 7 o'clock now. He's teased it out on social media. We're going to hear it for real today. The Prime Minister's former top advisor, Dominic Cummings, preparing to give evidence to MPs this morning about the government's handling of the COVID crisis. But how damaging will it be? We'll ask the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, both on the show today. Also this morning, the best-selling author who wasn't diagnosed with autism until she was 39. Now she wants to help others come out and take away the stigma. Plus, it takes you back, doesn't it? With a long-awaited Friends reunion about to air, we speak to the man who composed the iconic theme tune for the show. It is Wednesday, the 26th of May. The Prime Minister's former chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, prepares to give his side of the story on the government's pandemic planning as Tory MPs speculate about what's coming.
I told the Prime Minister some time ago that if he didn't get rid of Mr. Cummings, then the likelihood was that Mr. Cummings would bring him down.
Vaccine rollout to over 30-year-olds in England. But what's the latest on the India variant? We'll speak to the government's vaccine advisors on the programme today. A new video from Belarus. The girlfriend of the journalist taken from a Ryanair jet is put in front of the cameras by police. Celebrating his life. A vigil to mark the one-year anniversary of George Floyd's death as his family meet the President. A very good morning to you. This time last year, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson worked together fighting the COVID pandemic, but then they fell out. Now Downing Street is bracing itself as the Prime Minister's former advisor prepares to appear before MPs this morning to give his side of the story about how the government planned for the pandemic. He's already been tweeting his claims and the government has denied many of his allegations. Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, reports.
They were the closest of allies on Brexit in 2016 and in the general election in 2019. But after falling out spectacularly after Dominic Cummings left Downing Street at the end of last year, Boris Johnson and his former aide have become sworn enemies. Now Tory MPs fear Mr Cummings is hell-bent on revenge and out to destroy the Prime Minister.
I told the Prime Minister some time ago that if he didn't get rid of Mr Cummings, then the likelihood was that Mr Cummings would bring him down. I still think that is possible, and I hold to that view. The Twitter stream that's been coming out from Mr Cummings over recent days suggests that he doesn't intend to take prisoners.
Mr Cummings' main allegation in tweets over the past week is that Mr Johnson cost thousands of lives by delaying lockdowns and pursuing a policy of herd immunity. The government's chief scientific advisor told Sky News last year that communities becoming immune to coronavirus was part of controlling it.
I mean, what sort of percentage of people need to have contracted the virus?
Probably about 60% or so. And we think that this virus is likely to be one that comes back year on year, become like a seasonal virus, and communities will become immune to it. And that's going to be an important part of controlling this longer term.
Mr Cummings' demise began with his lockdown-busting trip to Durham last year and his explanation in a Downing Street news conference.
My wife was very worried, particularly given my eyesight had seemed to have been affected by the disease. She did not want to risk a nearly 300-mile drive with our child, given how ill I had been. We agreed that we should go for a short drive to see if I could drive safely. We drove for roughly half an hour and ended up on the outskirts of Barnardcastle town.
This former Whitehall advisor, sacked by Mr Cummings, claims this time he'll be accused of rewriting history.
Everybody has an agenda in Westminster. I think what Dominic Cummings will come out with is his version of the truth. I think he sincerely believes everything he says, and I think he's bringing it out into the open to get his point across and also to damage Boris Johnson and the government as much as possible.
Mr Cummings made his name operating in the shadows. Today he'll be centre stage. John Craig, Sky News.
And you can watch full coverage of that appearance by Dominic Cummings from 9:30 this morning, live here on Sky News. Well, let's talk to the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps. Morning to you. Look, I mean, how worried are you about what Dominic Cummings might say?
Well, I think he's probably tweeted most of what he's going to say already. And meanwhile, we're getting on with the job. As we can see, we've got vaccinations now running it. And I'm just looking at on your own ticker here. Over 44% of adults have had both vaccinations. Over 70, well over 70 have had one vaccination. And we're getting on top of this thing. And I think that's only happened because of decisions that were made more than a year ago, right at the beginning of this pandemic, where the Prime Minister put the money into research and development, building manufacturing capacity, and ensuring that we had this sort of world-beating rollout of the vaccine that we're all experiencing and benefiting from now as a population.
Yeah, but I mean, we have to. I mean, everyone would accept that mistakes were made. I mean, in the wake of just the scale of what this turned out to be. I mean, that's going to come as no surprise to anyone. But the Mail saying this morning the Prime Minister offered to be injected with COVID on live TV to show it was nothing to be scared of. Is there any truth in that?
Look, I think you're right the first time, which is that, we were making decisions under unprecedented situation. There's no rule book. There's no sort of textbook to sort of open and see how to deal with a pandemic. The last time the world faced anything like this was 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. And so it's easy to be sort of professors of hindsight. What I'd say is I think on the very big calls, which are things like developing the vaccine and having a program in place to roll it out faster than any other major equivalent economy, and being able to test now our entire population twice a week. Everybody's entitled to lateral flow tests, being able to sequence the genome, so the science behind it. I think on those big things we got it right. But you're right the first time. There was no rule book, and of course there would be mistakes made. But I think it's easy to sort of be the professor of hindsight and look back on these things.
Yeah, but there's, I mean, to be fair, there's nothing wrong then, is there, with transparency and admitting if some things were done incorrectly, if bad decisions were suggested, like being injected with COVID live on TV. I mean, look, if that's a mistake that was made, it's going to be helpful in diffusing this, isn't it, by admitting to it?
Well, I think the way to deal with it is through a public inquiry, which is what we've announced we'll do. A fully independent public inquiry, which will look into absolutely every aspect of this coronavirus. So I think that's the right way to do it. I think it's like one of the central accusations is that there wasn't going to be another lockdown, whereas in fact we had two further lockdowns after that apparent accusation in October, and we know we'd locked down in November and January. In fact, indeed, we're only still coming out of that last lockdown. So I'd also say let's look at what actually happened rather than what somebody says was said once in some meeting. And I think most people kind of just understand that, and certainly when I meet people, they say, look, we appreciate that there's no handbook to dealing with a pandemic, and for certain there will have been things that we could have done differently, and actually particularly before the pandemic we didn't have production facility for PPE, for example, in this country. We were barely producing any of it at all. We didn't have any facilities to test for coronavirus, which now we have 2 million tests a day.
But just to try to drag you back to the Dominic Cummings thing, I mean, why is he doing what he's doing then? Why has he tweeted what he's tweeted, which we'll hear repeated today, and maybe more information on top? Is he just a man spurned?
I'll leave others to determine how reliable a witness to all this is. I mean, he was there at the time, and what his motives would be, I'll leave to others. As I say, I think what most people are interested in is when are they getting their second vaccine if they haven't had it already, or when are they getting their first one if they're younger. And the good news on that is it will be coming down to 30-year plus this week, actually. So, we're getting through the population, bringing it down through the age groups, and I think that's what will be focusing most people's attention this week, rather than a sideshow over a former advisor who has his own agenda, presumably.
Well, not the first sideshow we've had with Dominic Cummings. And I know, as ministers, you get wheeled out to do interviews like this one, whether whether you want to or not, you were the first minister wheeled out on the Sunday morning shows after we heard about Dominic Cummings and his trip to Barnard Castle. And then, of course, your position was to defend him. You called it a perfectly sensible, rational step. He's attacking the government now. I mean, do you want to rethink that?
Yes, I think this tie-up is entirely coincidental. I happened to be doing the press conference that weekend, and as you say, was then speaking about events. I mean, as with back then, the reason I'm actually on today is to talk about £401 million of investment in rail, which will probably matter a lot more than a former advisor being in front of a select committee to the lives of your viewers. So, we're upgrading further upgrades, actually, to money I've announced previously on the Transpennine route, for example, upgrades in Exeter and in Thorpe Park at stations. These are real improvements to the infrastructure of our country, which will probably make, I'd love to talk about, because they'll probably actually make a real difference to people's lives in this country and come on top of massive reform of the railway, including the rail white paper last week. So, I mean, if your question is sort of edging at, would I rather be talking about things that people actually care about, will matter to their lives and their journeys, then of course the answer is yes.
Well, yes. Well, what I'm actually asking you is do you actually think it was a reasonable, rational step for Dominic Cummings to go to Barnard Castle, or now are you prepared to say actually you had to defend him at the time, but you didn't want to?
But if I'm going on to defend news from a year ago, then that's like another matter. Again, I remember on that occasion I was talking about £1 billion. This is 400 million today. I'm talking about £1 billion upgrade to the A66 and other things, roads that will matter to people's lives as well. Look, I don't want to sort of dredge all over the past. The Dominic Cummings trip to Barnard Castle, I think, has been covered in the media with more column inches than almost anything else. As I say, I think that what people are going to really care about is our ongoing response to getting out of this coronavirus crisis, looking to complete the unlocks and some of these great decisions on investment decisions that we're making, which will actually help people's journeys and people get about. That is the stuff that's going to matter.
You're absolutely right. You are absolutely right, Minister. It does matter, and one of the things that matters is how we deal with the Indian variant, which, of course, is a real concern. It is a variant of concern. Now, Angela Rayner says the confusion around the advice that's been given. We were talking about it yesterday about this sort of travel restriction guidance that was given to 8 of these key areas affected by the India variant, which you've now rolled back on. She's called it dangerously incompetent. Why is she wrong on that?
Well, look, we're not imposing any further local lockdowns at the moment. There's some additional advice and guidance issued because common sense tells you that if you're living in an area which has an infection rate which is much higher than the national norm, then it's sensible to think about the steps and to remind people about the steps that they should think about taking. And that's all it is.
Yeah, but forgive me for jumping in, but that's the key point in all of this, isn't it? I mean, we've heard a lot from you and others about taking personal responsibility now, which makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. How can people take personal responsibility for a change in guidance when they aren't aware there's been a change in guidance?
Well, as I say, it was put on the government website that these are the additional steps that you should be to remind ourselves of, which are all the usual things, by the way. It's better to meet people outside than inside, keep the 2 meters apart and the like. So it's sort of common sense advice. It was put up on the website. Now, if the argument is could that have been communicated better than actually, we think that's the case, and we'll certainly have a look at the way that that's communicated in the future. We had actually spoken to the local health authorities, and the idea was for it to be communicated on a local level. But as the vaccine minister said yesterday in the House, if there are better ways to communicate that, we'll look at doing that. But really, we're in a position now where, thanks to the extraordinary efforts of everybody in the NHS, the amazing ability to coronavirus test up to 2 million people per day in this country, the vaccine rollout, we're getting on top of these things. I think if we didn't offer any guidance, help, support, advice, people would rightly say, why haven't you said anything? And it was up on the website. If the accusation is, could you go further on these things, then I think that's probably right. But the key thing is, this is not a new lockdown. These are not new laws. It's just a piece of advice.
OK, look, there was a report yesterday about Islamophobia within the Conservative Party. We know the party said it's going to take on board all the recommendations. It said that the anti-Muslim sentiment remains a problem within the Conservative Party. Presumably by accepting the recommendations, the party agrees with that sentiment, does it? So how do you move to combat that?
Yes, I don't think there's any room in a modern political party for any form of discrimination of any type whatsoever, and in fact in society, and in political parties just as in society, sometimes you'll get these incidents, and the way that they're investigated and the way that they're handled is really, really important, which is why we asked for this fully independent report to be drawn up. We've accepted all 27, I think it is, recommendations behind the report, and we will enact them all, because this is a party which is a big, broad, wide, open party that wants people from every single different background, different parts of the country, we couldn't be clearer about that. So my view is it's always best to be open about it, get this report, and then act on it, which is exactly what we're going to do.
Well, you've got 6 weeks to come up with, by your own timetable, 6 weeks to come up with an action plan on that, on the back of Baroness Varsi saying that it shows the party is institutionally racist.
Well, I thought it was a surprising thing to say, because Baroness Varsi is actually a former chairman of the party. And it's not what the report said as well. The report said the party is certainly not institutionally racist. It did say that there are problems with the way that sometimes complaints are dealt with, although it also said this isn't specific to complaints about Islamophobia. The party structure, any party structure, tends to be a bit unusual in as much as you have a central party, but then you also have effectively 650 local parties in every part of the country, constituencies in every part of the country. And so, and they're run by local volunteers. And so there are doubtless, and I think this is what the report highlights, ways to improve all of that, both centrally and locally. And that's exactly what we'll do. As I say, let me just be absolutely clear. There is no space for any form of phobia in the Conservative Party.
All right, let me jump in, and I'm sorry to do so, but we are really pushing against the clock, and your people want you to move on, I know. Can we end on some good news? It looks like, is it right that we're going to get green light? We might not be getting green light for Greece or for Spain necessarily, but the islands, the Canary Islands, Balearic Islands, Greek islands, may be heading onto the green list soon. Is that right?
Well, we'll have to wait for the Joint Biosecurity Centre to provide their readout from all of this. I think that story, which I saw on the front of one of the papers today, just comes from the fact that we've always said in the past have tried to assess islands separately. Whether that's possible or not isn't just down to the level of infection on those islands. It's also down to their abilities, for example, to sequence the genome, so we know about the variants and potential variants of concern on those islands as well. So not to disappoint you and your viewers, the next review is the first week in June, so not very far away, and I'm afraid we will have to wait until then, not least, Steve, because actually I don't have that information from the Joint Biosecurity Centre, who are still carrying out that work in order to make sure it's as up-to-date as possible.
We will be waiting with bated breath, of course. Minister, good to see you this morning. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, still to come on the programme, we're going to hear from two former Number 10 advisers, one Labour, one Tory, as Dominic Cummings prepares to tell us his version of what went on in Downing Street at the height of the pandemic. 30-year-olds have had the call up for their vaccines, but there's new concern about blood clots. We'll talk to a specialist at 7:45. And at 8:05, we'll hear from the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, ahead of Dominic Cummings' appearance before that parliamentary committee. Now, the authorities in Belarus have released a video of the girlfriend of the dissident journalist Roman Protasevich. Sofia Sapega was taken off the Ryanair plane, forced to divert to Minsk and arrested at the same time as her boyfriend.
I am Sofia Sapega Andreevna. I was born on the 10th of February 1998. I am citizen of the Russian Federation. I live in Lithuania, Vilnius. On 23rd of May 2001, I flew on the same plane with Roman Protasevich.
Talk to our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, who's in Brussels. What are we to make of this video, Adam?
Well, it's the second video, of course, released by the Belarusian authorities. Roman Protasevich's video was the first. This is his girlfriend, and I think they have put them out as an attempt to do two things. One is, on the face of it, to offer reassurance that these two people are alive and in one piece. But the second, really, is to say to the world and to say to dissidents in Belarus, here we are, these people opposed us, and look where they are now, in captivity and facing a form of justice. I spoke yesterday to a man called Stepan Potilio, who is the co-founder of the Nexta channel alongside Roman Protasevich. And he said that he was getting death threats pretty much every day, and he regarded that this arrest and this process of bringing the airliner down in Minsk under what I think most people now agree to be false pretenses as being an effort by the government of Alexander Lukashenko to intimidate him and other opponents of the regime, and also to demonstrate the strength that Mr. Lukashenko thinks that he has to control any dissident forces. Now, the European Union, the UK, and the wider world, the United States, have reacted with absolute shock, revulsion and disgust at this process, endorsing the idea that this was a hijacker, an air piracy, a kidnapping. But in a sense, Mr. Lukashenko seems to have already found himself in a corner, regarded as a rogue leader and dismissed as an illegitimate leader. This is a message he's sending out to dissidents in his own country, that he cannot be brought down easily. And this video, clearly filmed under some form of duress, is part of that jigsaw.
OK, Adam, thank you. Hundreds of people held a vigil last night to celebrate the life of George Floyd on the one-year anniversary of his murder. His family met President Biden and called for America to work together to make sure people no longer live in fear. Helen Ann Smith reports from Minneapolis.
George Floyd! What's his name? George Floyd!
A year on, they remember.
What's his name? George Floyd! What's his name? George Floyd!
A man, his death, and a story that shocked the world and shook America.
Black lives matter! Black lives matter!
George Floyd and what happened here is now so symbolic of an age-old American struggle, a grief and a grievance still far from resolved.
We rioted and looted for change. We did that for our ancestors.
This place has left its mark upon history, even if there's a way still to go. For the Floyd family, that brings comfort and pride amidst a day wrought with emotion.
I think if we had just had him pass away or die and nothing happened as a result of it, it would have felt like it was not worth the pain and suffering. And don't get me wrong, I definitely wish I could have him back, but since we can't, this is nice to be able to see all of the people who are in support of us.
Other members of the family went to Washington. The president paid tribute to their extraordinary courage and said America had to take action. They'd all hoped police reform legislation would be passed by today.
If you can make federal laws to protect the bird, which is the bald eagle, you can make federal laws to protect people of color.
Say his name.
George Floyd.
George Floyd. Make some noise for George Floyd, y'all.
In what was once an ordinary junction, they commemorated and celebrated, the young and the old together. But there's tension here too, born from decades of brutality and a sense that not enough's changed.
Amidst the carnival atmosphere here, there's a tentative sense of hope too, a feeling that just maybe this time tragedy and trauma might lead to meaningful change.
We gon' do it all night. I do it for George Floyd and Dante Wright. And of course I do it. Yo, it's all sacred.
It will be hard fought, but the eyes of the world are still watching, as they were just 1 year ago. This is reflection and remembrance in a remarkable place, where history's been made and they want to make more. Helen Ann Smith, Sky News, Minneapolis.
And tonight you can watch a special programme looking at the wider issue of racial equality in the wake of Mr Floyd's death. That's George Floyd, From Murder to Justice, 9 o'clock tonight here on Sky News. Now, a key question around the anniversary of George Floyd's death is whether conversations around race and inequality taking place in the UK are actually improving people's lives. Sky News is launching a new project today to actually address this. Let's talk to our home editor, Jason Farrell. What's happening, Jason?
Well, a group of academics from the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity and the Sky News data team are working together and launching a new project to try and find out about the data gaps in our knowledge. What we've discovered is that actually there's quite a lot of things we don't know about the range of diverse groups living in the UK. And these academics feel that that could lead to poor policy decisions, those gaps in our knowledge. So, for example, on mental health, there's not really any single study that cross-sections the outcomes, mental health outcomes of people by their ethnicity. These academics have looked at old studies, for example, admissions to mental health wards, and found that actually if you're black, you're 5 times more likely to have a serious mental health problem than if you're white. So why is that? Could there be a better study on that? Equally, if you're looking at the vaccination programme, for example, and health, in the Bangladeshi community, there was a study that found that 20% of people over the age of 50 to 59 thought that they had poor health. But at a separate study on white people, it doesn't get to that level until they get to in their 80s, 80 to 89. So there needs to, these academics feel, be a single study that looks at those kind of things. And also, not just lumping ethnic groups in necessarily as having one single experience. So, for example, what is the difference between the experiences of people living in rural areas compared to living in the city? A lot of our surveys on black ethnic minorities, for example, look at what's going on in cities. But 250,000 people from ethnic minorities live in rural areas. If you look, for example, at the stop and search figures, you're 23 times more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black in Dorset than if you're white, whereas it's only 4 times more in London. So these are the kind of things that they're going to look at. Let's hear from Dr. Nisa Finney, who's one of the academics who's working on this.
It will also cover topics and aspects of life that are relatively unknown about for minority communities, such as political attitudes, financial circumstances, health and mental health, well-being, religious and ethnic identities.
So it's going to be called the Evidence on Equality National Survey. It's going to cover 20,000 people. It should be reporting before the end of the year and will be across what it finds.
OK, Jason, thank you. You can see the full story on Sky News from 5 o'clock tonight, and people from minority ethnic and religious groups can find out more about the survey and how to take part at evensurvey.co.uk. Now, a Dutch court will rule today on a landmark court case which could force the oil giant Shell to cut CO2 emissions by almost half by 2030. Climate activist groups want the company to align its policies with the climate goals set out in the Paris Agreement. Shell, which says it plans to go net zero by 2050 or sooner, says court action will not accelerate the transition from fossil fuels. And, of course, you can watch the Daily Climate Show here on Sky News, 6:30 and 9:30 every weekday. Police in Northamptonshire have arrested 3 people after the death of a 16-year-old boy in Corby. Police officers were called to reports of a stabbing in Constable Road, but the force said, despite the best efforts of paramedics, the boy died at the scene. The Foreign Secretary will meet Israeli and Palestinian leaders today as he visits Jerusalem and the occupied West Bank as parts of efforts to maintain a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Mr Raab will be pushing the UK's support for a 2-state solution. Well, this is Sky News Breakfast. Let's see what's happening in the weather for you today. Joe, any better?
Yes, better.
Oh.
Not completely better yet. We've still got the effects of this area of low pressure affecting us. But as we go towards the bank holiday weekend, high pressure building in, so we see more settled conditions and it will get warmer as well. Let's take a look.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello there, good morning to you. Well, we're not quite out of the woods yet because this is still associated with the area of low pressure, which is pushing away, crossing Denmark now. So it's still a little bit unsettled as we go through the course of the day. But we will see more in the way of sunshine, drier conditions and higher temperatures too. So first thing this morning, it's a little bit grey over much of Scotland, northeastern parts of England. Here we've got some rain and that's going to be working its way southwards through the course of the day. But it's dying out as it goes. So for a while we will turn rather cloudy in parts, and elsewhere, after a bright start, cloud will bubble up. And we'll see a few showers developing too. One or two of these could be on the heavy side with the odd rumble of thunder. But temperatures up to around 18 or 19 degrees Celsius at best, that's 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Through the course of the afternoon, that area of cloud makes its way down into parts of East Anglia, but it is fizzling out as it goes. And certainly as we go through this evening and overnight, many of the showers will disappear. Nice bright start for most tomorrow morning, away from eastern coast, a bit murky.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Joe, thank you. Still to come on Sky News Breakfast, from friend to foe, Dominic Cummings set to give a scathing review of Boris Johnson's handling of the pandemic to MPs today.
Financial institutions, which are at the heart of the UK economy, are also at the heart of the UK carbon economy. And there's no way you can take climate change seriously in the UK till we start to get a grip on the emissions that are not just enabled, but actually directly financed by UK financial institutions. The millions and millions of pounds that they make available through loans, syndicated loan arrangements, through the investments in companies literally around the world is the capital, it's the money that keeps those companies and those emitters going. Without that finance, without the support of those financial institutions, there's absolutely no way that any of that activity could take place. Now, nobody's saying that you have to turn it off overnight. Nobody is saying that there is, that there isn't going to be a transition period. But the reality is we've got about 10 years to almost half our carbon emissions between now and 2030 to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. The UK government's been very clear. They want to be a leader in this space. If you want to be a leader in this space, they have to get a grip on the UK's single biggest thing they could probably do to reduce our carbon emissions in that time. One of the really amazing things that this study shows is that the reach of UK financial institutions goes far beyond UK borders, and that the UK financed emissions are far bigger, almost twice as big as UK's direct emissions. So that is possibly our most direct relationship to the global problem, is how we finance it around the world. There are going to have to be rules with regular milestones that are both checked and enforced by government to make sure we get there as a sector, as a country, as a whole.
Now Downing Street is bracing itself as the Prime Minister's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, prepares to appear before MPs this morning to give his side of the story about how the government planned for the pandemic. A few minutes ago, I spoke to the Transport Secretary, who called Mr Cummings' appearance a sideshow.
I'll leave others to determine how reliable a witness to all this is. I mean, he was there at the time, and what his motives would be, I'll leave to others. As I say, I think what most people are interested in is when are they getting their second vaccine if they haven't had it already, or when are they getting their first one if they're younger. And the good news on that is it will be coming down to 30-year plus this week, actually. So, you know, we're getting through the population, bringing it down through the age groups, and I think that's what will be focusing most people's attention this week, rather than a sideshow over a former advisor who has his own agenda, presumably.
Let's head to Downing Street and our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It's more about what Grant Shapps doesn't say than what he does there.
Yes, that's right, Stephen. And while he seemed to be brushing it off, saying we're looking to the future, this is someone who was damaged by his explanations for going to Barnard Castle and acting as if the government are just powering on ahead. There are nerves behind the scenes about what Dominic Cummings will say today. He's not just any disgruntled former employee. He was the Prime Minister's chief advisor. He was sitting in those meetings when the fateful decisions were made leading up to the first and second lockdowns last year. And we know from what he's been writing on Twitter over the last few days that his contention is that he was pushing for an early lockdown and a tough lockdown to get a grip on the virus, and he claims that it was the Prime Minister who was dithering, who was delaying, who was making what Dominic Cummings calls awful decisions, which led to the deaths potentially of tens of thousands of people. Now, we don't know what Dominic Cummings is going to bring with him to those MPs. Will it just be his word against the Prime Minister's? Will he have documents or emails to back up what he's saying? But of course, while Dominic Cummings will be asked whether he shoulders any of the responsibility for these poor decisions, there will be nerves behind the scenes about what damaging details might come out.
OK, thank you. Let's talk to John McTernan, the former top-level Labour Party advisor, and Sir Craig Oliver, the former Communications Director at Number 10, when David Cameron was Prime Minister. Good to see you both this morning. I mean, Craig, just how damaging could this be, do you think?
Well, I think so much of politics is expectation management, and I think that Dominic Cummings over the last few days has raised the bar for what he has to achieve today. He clearly wants to do some damage to the Prime Minister. He clearly wants to make out the government wasn't competent and that Boris Johnson took the wrong choices. But a lot of information's already out there. We've had this discussion for a very long time, and we've also had a number of elections recently where it seems many people were prepared to give the benefit of the doubt to the government. So I'm not saying that he won't do some damage today, but I think that it's probably going to be more noisy than effective.
I mean, is there a sense, John, that people will just see this as a man with an agenda?
It depends what he says, doesn't it? I think Craig is right about that. And the key is, this isn't just any advisor of the, of the hundreds that a government has over its lifetime. This is a man who was in the room. He was in the room for all of the critical decisions. And he, at the time he was in Number 10, he was regarded as the key advisor, the chief advisor, the Svengali, the one who knew exactly what the Prime Minister wanted, what the Prime Minister was doing at any one time. And I think that's the interest for anybody who cares about politics is why were the decisions made the way they were? It's like any inquiry. What did the Prime Minister know when, and what did he do as a consequence? And I think we have, the House Commons Select Committee has a chance today to answer those questions. Will it impact on the public? Who knows? But it will definitely bring new information to light. And I think it will possibly pivot around this thing that Dominic's come back to again and again in his Twitter thread, which is, was there a strategy of herd immunity that was then abandoned, but wasn't explained as being abandoned? Because this government does say it does one thing, then changes, and never says it changed. It just keeps on ploughing on. The question is, what will the revealing of the discussions internally do for the government?
I mean, in terms of that herd immunity policy, and we know from my interview with the chief scientific advisor in March last year, Craig, I mean, it was certainly something they were looking at. That's going to be very hard to deny, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's certainly going to be very hard to deny. I also remember when we were discussing this at the time that there was a lot of stories in the newspapers saying that it was actually something that Dominic Cummings thought was worthy of considering. And I think that's going to be one of his difficulties today. He's somebody who has said and set himself up when he was in government as the most powerful figure there, that he was running the show, he was in charge. And I suspect you'll get quite a lot of questions about, well, hang on a minute, weren't you supposed to actually be in the room and directing some of this stuff? And I also think it's interesting that you see what Grant Shapps' tactic there was. I think he's going to try, and the government will try and present him as somebody who's disgruntled and discredited. He is, remember, the person in the public consciousness who basically broke the rules that he was involved in setting and then thought it was a good idea to have an eye test by driving his car around. That's a credibility problem. And I think that on top of that, there's another credibility problem of, hang on a minute, mate, you were actually in the room. So he's going to have to come up with something, I think, a lot more than was the government pursuing herd immunity, because frankly, I think people will say, we've heard all about that and we've made our decision already.
Yeah, but in terms of that credibility problem, Craig, I mean, isn't part of the issue with that is that when all that was kicking off and people were furious about it, the Prime Minister was staunchly defending him.
It was, and I think that this is what's interesting, is you can keep talking about it and you can keep going back to the past and you can point out that was wrong, that was a problem. The public aren't fools. They saw all that. It was all over the media, it was all over programmes like Sky News, and they were able to make a decision at the ballot box very recently. I don't want to dismiss the seriousness of this, but I think it's really important to make a distinction between what the media considers to be extremely important and is going to cause damage and what the public actually consider. And at the end of the day, I think it's going to have taken an awful lot more than has actually come out so far and what's hinted is going to be coming out to do real damage.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the problem for the Labour Party in all of this, John, isn't it? I mean, is there actually anything they can capitalise on here or indeed would want to capitalise on?
Oh, look, never interfere with your enemy when they're attacking themselves. So I think the Labour Party will stand back from this. But also I think the Labour Party will seek to draw a line between the policy last year, the confusion, the changes, the briefing, the lack of clarity on communications, and what's happening at the moment. You know, are there local travel bans or aren't there? They were announced, then they've been de-announced, and I think that confusion in communications, the hesitation about the lockdown, private sector companies were locking down before the government lockdown. So I think it reminds people of that. And look, this time last year, Grant Shapps would have been wheeled out and all the other pliant cabinet ministers would have been wheeled out to defend Dominic Cummings. So what's revealing is the behaviour of the loyal cabinet ministers who are media performers. Last year they'd been defending Dom. This year they're attacking him, and some of it will come through. It's bit by bit is the way that you make a case from opposition about the government, and this is a bit more another brick in the wall.
Yep. But if you were advising Keir Starmer, John, at the moment, I mean, what would you be saying to him? Because I mean, there's a danger here, isn't there, for the Labour Party? They adopted this sort of constructive, critical support, if you like, of what was happening and approved and agreed with a lot of the actions that the government took in the very height of the pandemic. Yeah. I mean, they could put themselves in the firing line if they're too critical, couldn't they?
Oh, look, in the end, Craig's right. The public will make their minds up about this. I don't believe that the recent elections in early May were a referendum on the conduct of the pandemic. They're a referendum on Boris Johnson, which he did really well in, as he did in the general election. He's an incredibly popular politician with a very, very deep reach into many traditional Labour voters. The Labour Party has to allow the public to make their mind up about the totality of the handling of the pandemic. You can't lead the public to a conclusion. What you can do is focus on things which show something about the character and the judgment of the government. And so what can we tell at the moment? We can tell they're as confused in their messaging about Blackburn and Bolton as they were last year about was it herd immunity or not herd immunity. There's something about their unwillingness to change their mind or to admit they made a mistake. Now, at the moment, that doesn't matter. It will matter over the long run. So you build a case over time. And politics will come back as normal by the end of the year when we're out of the pandemic and we're into unemployment.
OK, look, we've got to leave it there. John McTernan and Sir Craig Oliver, it's good to talk to you both this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let me know what you think at Sky Stephen. Do you care about this? Or would you rather focus on what is happening to get out of the pandemic and the vaccinations and what have you, as Grant Shapps was saying earlier on? Love to hear your thoughts this morning. Now, when the pandemic hit, film and TV production, or a lot of it at least, was shut down, with companies forced to find new technologies and locations in order to get cameras rolling again. But now some of those temporary measures look like they could become the new normal. Here's our entertainment reporter, Claire Gregory.
When lockdown hit, the film and TV industry needed a game plan to satisfy the ever-growing appetites of content-hungry audiences. For live sport fans, suddenly unable to fill stadiums, the pandemic spelled disaster. But a tactical move to remote production, 5G SIM cards and delivering via the cloud means Sky Sports has aired more than 100 live netball games since COVID broke out, compared to only 20 the previous year.
We've certainly had some unexpected challenges along the way. The recent social media boycott meant we had to adapt very quickly to deliver via the cloud on those front channels. But it's really meant that we're in a situation where this hopefully will become business as usual and we can roll it out across a number of our sports.
Mandalorian, look outside. They're waiting for
From live sport to high-end drama, for productions forced to minimise crews or unable to access certain locations, the rollout of new virtual production technology used on The Mandalorian has accelerated.
As he moves the camera around, the perspective actually changes. So, previously we were just using the wall as a backdrop, but now you can kind of see as he moves around, that square on the screen there will update with it. So if we were to sort of, walk around slightly and move, you can kind of see how we're not just standing against a backdrop, we're actually in a 3D space.
One of the advantages to this technology is that the screens can be almost instantly changed at the touch of a button. So a production can move from a factory in Russia like this to a bar in Nashville like this, without moving location.
While COVID travel restrictions have meant many countries favoured by filmmakers haven't been available, not all actors have to completely abandon their ambition to travel. As a COVID-safe location, the Caribbean island of Nevis has signed a 2-picture deal launching the film industry there.
A lot of people are unable to go to locations now, so we're able to bring the locations to them.
The TV and film industry may have been forced to adapt because of the pandemic, but with some of the new options benefiting not just the productions themselves, but also the environment, thanks to the reduced carbon footprint, the changes are likely to be around long after restrictions lift. Claire Gregory, Sky News.
All of this is real, just to let you know. This is Sky News Breakfast. Still to come, we're going to be talking to a leading specialist about vaccines for 30-year-olds and the new warning about the risk of blood clots.
Only about half a mile from the Turkish coast, and it's evident that the boat seriously overcrowded. This is one of the most severe viruses in the world.
I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is going to be the biggest party Tripoli has ever seen.
That's it, it got us then. There's a lot of action going on, a lot of still.
We aim to be the best and the most trusted place in news.
Clearly not had very much to eat at all, a lot of them extremely thin and very frail.
Her arms, look at her arms. I can put my entire hand round. This is the cocktail of drugs which the doctors at this hospital have been giving their coronavirus patients. Made for people who want clarity in an uncertain world.
Once it takes
hold. It's very, very difficult for these firefighters to get a grip of it and get on top of it and put it out. The world's largest falls now down to a trickle in places.
I can't imagine how much plastic is lying at the bottom of this huge lake. Oh!
Getting up close and personal with a rhino.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
For the early risers.
As we examine the story beyond the headline.
For the knowledge seekers.
Welcome to Divided States.
For the straight talkers. The curious and the ones who want to be entertained.
Backstage, Sky News' entertainment podcast.
For wherever you are.
Welcome to the Sophie Ridge on Sunday podcast.
For the ones who want to know more.
Welcome to the All Out Politics podcast.
For the listeners.
From Sky News Storycast.
Sky News Podcasts. Listen and subscribe for free.
OK, let's talk about the vaccines and talk to Dr. Maggie Wearmouth, who's a GP who sits on the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. It's really good to see you this morning. First and foremost, what's your view on the vaccine uptake at the moment? I mean, very well in a lot of age groups, a lot of categories. Obviously, as we move down the age group, is there any concern?
Well, we are doing fantastically well with this rollout. I'm a one-day-a-week GP, but I also do some vaccination. And the courage and the enthusiasm and the people waiting outside. I do a mobile vaccination unit, and I have people queuing across a park in Brighton waiting to be vaccinated. And people are just very, very keen to have this vaccine. They know what the risks are in terms of protecting themselves and other people, and they're really keen to have this. We've given 60 million doses of various vaccines, over 30 million of AstraZeneca. And people have got confidence in this vaccine because they realise just how dangerous the coronavirus is. And they realise that having the vaccine and 2 vaccines is much more safe than taking a chance and not having the vaccine at all.
Forgive me for interrupting, but the problem that we are seeing, in particular with the Indian variant, it would seem to be that a lot of the hospitalisation in places like Bolton and Blackburn and these sort of hotspots, as we call them, would seem to be from people who should have been vaccinated. So there is still a hesitancy issue amongst some groups.
There are some places where there was hesitancy at first, and these people have not been vaccinated when they were eligible. So our message is, if you're eligible, even if this was weeks ago, you should go and get your first dose. There are some people who were worried. There was fake news being spread around, particularly towards our Muslim colleagues. And people took that seriously. And sadly, the fake news was given more credibility than government advice. So the question is that we must reach out to the vulnerable groups who were eligible months ago and remain vulnerable.
Well, can I ask, what do we know about the state of vaccines at this stage in regard to something like the India variant? We see there seems to be an agreement that they are somewhat effective. Do we know how effective?
Well, the recent results are actually incredibly encouraging, both for AstraZeneca and for the Pfizer. But the stress is on having two vaccine jabs. That's the most important thing, is completing the programme. We know that there's slightly reduced efficacy for Pfizer from 93% to 88%, but this is still extraordinarily good in terms of vaccine experience. And the efficacy for AstraZeneca has dropped from 66 to 60%. But on a population basis, this is extraordinary, because we know that both of these vaccines actually reduce transmission. So that by taking 2 jabs, one is protecting oneself, but one is also protecting one's loved ones and the community around you.
Yeah, look, just if I can, in 30 seconds, should we see the vaccine, particularly in hotspot areas, rolled out to younger people, to 18s and over?
Well, we are moving down the ages, but we are concentrating on the vulnerable people. because those are the people who will, if they catch it, they will be hospitalized. So the program is right. We are just increasing the speed, but we should be moving down the ages in the correct order and still concentrating on the vulnerable older people who we know will end up in hospital if they're not vaccinated.
Dr.
We're doing
Wearmouth,
the
good
right thing, we're just changing the speed.
Yeah, look, we're out of time. It's really good to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
OK, quick check on the weather for you with Joe.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Hello, good morning to you. Well, we haven't seen the last of the rather damp weather, but things are improving, and certainly the bank holiday weekend is looking pretty good. This morning, not too bad, but we do have this area of cloud and rain over parts of Scotland, northeastern England, and that's going to be working its way southwards through the day. It is breaking up as it goes, and eventually, in the sunnier spots, we'll see temperatures up to around 19 degrees Celsius, that's 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Could be a few showers around, and where they do occur, could be quite heavy with some thunder, but most of those showers and a lot of the day's cloud will also disappear as we go into this evening and overnight.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.